one's the Gilded Age, Industrial Revolution second. But uh, we had a discussion about Soul of the Indian and Mother Jones on Thursday. Did anybody have any reflective thoughts? Walked out of this classroom, something from the text that you wanted to share? And make sure you got something in front of you. You never want to have a blank desk in front of you. Make that a habit in all your college classes. Anything that struck you with Soul of the Indian? As you walked out of class, thought about it perhaps over the weekend? Something you weren't able to share in the class last week? Yeah, I mean, the contrast is extraordinary. Uh, Coming from a primary source, from somebody that actually lived it. Um, Things are changing, and so there's more sensitivity, awareness, but you get the sense writ large that, okay, yeah, women have babies and you'll get over it or whatever. There's not a lot of support. The medicalization of childbirth is great that we have that in case things go wrong. Things can go wrong, but as a default, going to a hospital and again, I'm just privy to this because my wife was in the birth work for 14 years. It actually complicates birth. You're in a hospital, you got things beeping, strange people you've never met before are coming and going, new nurses, doctor wasn't able to make it, you've been working with, who's this guy? Some doctors are very aware and respectful, but others are not, and so they can be very evasive. Typically, a woman is on her back giving birth. She's discouraged from getting up, but the room is small, so getting on all fours or squatting is, I mean, you could always do that, but sometimes it just doesn't seem convenient. So the contrast is amazing. Just, I get the sense that mothers in Dakota were so empowered. I mean, the fact that I just find extraordinary that they gave birth alone. Not out of shame, but out of being empowered, they could do it. And where would they get that empowerment from? Yeah, the tribe. This is something they've been prepared for all of their lives. It's deeply honored. We're bringing new life to our tribe to perpetuate our tribe. And each time I read Soul of the Indian, I sign this every semester. It's tragic because clearly something has been lost. Doesn't mean it's gone, but they had a tribe. And that tribe was their family. And that there were no outsiders in the tribe. That's really important to understand. We have outsiders. If you don't fit into the box within our society, for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons. If we think about gender, if you step outside of the boxes of gender, things are loosening up quite a bit, but there's still hostility to people who don't meet the requirements for being a man. In a lot of tribal societies, for instance, like an effeminate man, that exists, right? Men who you look at them, they look like a man, but when they talk, they present themselves, they're a little bit effeminate. Typically in indigenous cultures, because they had the ability to transcend both male energy and female energy, they were the holy people of their tribes. They were the shamans. And when people transgressed, they weren't put into, I don't know, like some sort of teepee that was a jail. They were people, their elders talked to them. Obviously, especially when you're young, you're going to do stupid stuff. That's universal to the human experience. But you wouldn't be shunned. And there were measures, especially for young men, from chapter 1, what were young men expected to do as they became teenagers?
They would go with their father.
Yeah. Well, maybe with their father, but what would they have? Whether they did it with somebody or not, or alone, what would they do? And what was that called? The bombade. The bombade. What was the bombade?
Was it a solitary religious retreat?
Yes. Solitary religious retreat. As a young man, you would go out and it was, some women would do it, but it wasn't discrimination that this is just for men. It was because men needed it. Men need it. Why don't you think women need? Because you'd go out alone, almost naked. I mean, imagine that. Imagine you being 12, 13 years old and go to that mountain, to that forest. Don't come back for 3 or 4 days. What do you think's going on there? Besides whatever religious experience they might have. And they, yeah.
I know that growing up with their mother, they would be taught more so, but it was only until they reached a certain age, which was 8 or so, to really have to experience it for themselves. Yeah. So you can be taught something, but unless you go through it, you won't fully grasp the depth of it. I think that's what was going on.
Yeah, you're not. Yeah, and what do you think you're going to experience if you're out in the woods or some mountain? There's wild animals. You got to figure out how to feed yourself.
Responsibility.
Yeah, responsibility. What were you saying? Survival. And to back up a little bit, what tends to happen to young men? Not all young men, but what tends to happen to young men when they become 12, 13, 14 years old? What's that? Puberty. And how does their attitude begin to change?
It's a more like drastic, extreme change.
Well, describe the typical experience of a young guy who's now 13, 14 years old. He's not a child anymore. He still has parents, and they're always telling him what to do. They get angry.
I think
rebellious, right? A little arrogant, right? That's a very real thing. I have a 16-year-old son, and man, does he know everything. When I was 16, I knew everything. Do you know everything when you're 16?
No.
If your parents said, get the hell out of my house, would you be in a lot of trouble? You would be in a lot of trouble because you don't know anything. But it is a confusing time because, yeah, you're not a child anymore. You're developing a sense of who you are. And then you got these these older people, your parents, your grandparents, uncles, who are like, hey, I saw you, they're always getting on your case, man. And that's perfectly normal, but that's what gets young men in trouble. They quit listening to their elders. And sometimes that's warranted. Sometimes you're around elders that you shouldn't listen to. But generally speaking, you tend to forget that, oh, or you don't even appreciate that these elders, whether it's my parents, my grandparents, they've lived a life. They've gone through what I've gone through. And so, yeah, going out into the woods or some mountain or a desert for 3 or 4 days, you're going to come back humble and realize I need this tribe. Why is that not so necessary for young women? And again, it's not discriminatory. It's not that this is only for the men because men are superior and women, they don't need this sense of humility.
Cause they already.
I'm sorry, I'm in, oh,
Yeah, where would a young woman begin to get that humility?
Our
Their
mothers.
mothers.
Well, sons have mothers.
so I'm in a very loud place, I'm sorry, just tell me to mute if it's too loud. But if the women have our own trials,
Nurtured
of-
more.
I don't think,
Like, as far, well, I'm not saying nurtured more than men, but
Well, so I've never menstruated, just to share something about myself to y'all. Never gone through that experience. But if I were to all of a sudden menstruate, I think there's this, what I imagine is there's this realization as, oh, I'm not in control. I don't have control over this body. It's deeply inconvenient, especially if you're young. It might be frightening, especially if nobody's talked to you about what's about to happen. And then the hormonal shifts, right? That's a real thing. Some women, there's always a spectrum, but it's difficult to contend with the hormonal shifts. You're not in control. Or a young man doesn't experience that. And then just the added thing of what the implications of menstruation, like I can get pregnant. And then if you do get pregnant, then you really realize, oh, I'm not in control of any of this. And you could, I think women have a greater capacity. I'm talking in generalities here, but I think women, because of that experience, universally, just the human experience, have a greater capacity of understanding I'm not in 100% control of this lived situation. And therefore, I understand I need people, right? And I think what tend to happen in tribal societies when a young woman began to menstruate, they would be brought usually into a specific tent. There would be elderly women saying, this is what's happening. This is beautiful. You're becoming a woman now, right? It wouldn't just be a parent finding out, oh, you're menstruating. I'll make sure I get you some tampons or a pad of HEB, right? Or your dad going, congratulations, some awkward thing like that, right? It's built into the tribe that this is a thing. And so women, I think, have a greater capacity to understand I'm not in control, where I think young men kind of need that. That's very universal to have rites of passage. It's not just for indigenous people, but it goes back through almost every society. And that's something we've lost. One thing, just to finish this off too, in History 1301, we talk about the Enlightenment. So if you've taken 1301, when you're studying the American Revolution, you have this philosophical movement of European philosophers and American philosophers who focused on the worth of the individual and turned the table around on, because it used to be, you got the government, the state, religious institutions, and everybody within that society is at the grace, is subservient to those institutions. Your individual worth really didn't matter. And so that's where a lot of exploitation was available, brutality, prejudice, where ideas of this what it means to be a woman, that's what it means to be a man, ideas of black, white, rich, poor. And that's good that was upended to some degree. But if you think about contrasting, just let alone that a woman was able to give birth by herself, an appreciation of how absolutely empowered those women must have been, supported by their tribe. still individuals understood as individuals, but having this web of support within the tribe where we don't have that anymore. There comes a time as a young person where you begin to realize, I have to figure this whole thing out myself. I have to figure out if I want to be religious or not. I have to figure out what I want to do with my life, what profession I'm going to go into, what type of people I'm going to hang out with. So on the one hand, it's energizing. The world is your oyster. But man, if you've ever wondered, why am I so anxious? Why am I depressed? Well, since the 1700s, that's only accelerated through the 1800s, 1900s, and into the 21st century. The modern human being is literally Atlas, carrying the globe on his or her shoulders. Where when we read Soul of the Indian, what you're reading there is a people, the Kota, which meant people, of people who had each other's backs, and there were rituals and expressions of love and support and a place for everybody within it. And it's, again, it's something lost. Brittany, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to touch up on the people coming together. I also like the celebration of whenever they get betrothed to one another, they kind of go off by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. Like there's no type of grand ceremony that takes place. Like it's just like something small, something private. I thought that was pretty cool. They're like go off into the woods, I think.
Yeah, that's beautiful because celebrations of marriage, that's great that we have that, but man, what pressure is on there. Everybody has an idea of what your wedding should look like and all of that. But it seems like in Dakota culture, two young people get attracted to each other, they fall in love, they begin to have a sexual relationship, and it's really nobody's business, and they have complete agency. It's not a sense of possession. They didn't have in their language, that is my wife. That is my husband.
No prenups.
Yeah. And if somebody got tired of that relationship, you're a woman and you ended up hooking up with a guy that's not a really good hunter, right? Or you're just not jiving together. There's no lawyers involved, right? No, I'm sure ego is involved. I'm sure heartbreak is universal, but it wasn't this big to do. Find somebody else. Yeah, that's an interesting thing to point out. Okay, let's move on. Okay, good. Well, let's go back to Mother Jones. And I think we left off on social Darwinism. So again, just to recap, Mother Jones, very interesting historical figure, little old lady that spent the latter years of her life walking into coal mine towns, textile town, company town. What's a company town?
A town built for the company and workers like coal mines.
Yeah.
Convenient.
Yeah, exactly. And what did the company town provide?
Store, housing, facilities.
Yeah, why was this exploitive? In many cases.
They can charge their own prices.
You got paid in company script, not US currency, typically in these company towns. Company controlled how much you paid for rent, for groceries, and the value of your company script. So it's this ridiculous system where it just put workers in a lot of debt. So she would visit those types of towns, and very dangerous to do that because not only do they own all of the little homes or shacks, the doctor, the grocery store,
Law enforcement.
yeah, they have their own law enforcement, right? And so her superpower was being a little old lady. Like if someone looking like me went into a company town trying to organize workers, it was dangerous for Mother Jones to do that, but far more dangerous than anyone who didn't present as a little old lady. I imagine young men who were there to guard the company town would see this little old lady like, what am I supposed to do here? I'll hit her over the head. And then to boot, she was strident, man. She would just like, what are you gonna do? Hit me? And she would demasculate young men always. How did your mother raise you? Are you that much of a little boy that this is how you earn your money, by hitting people? What kind of little boy trapped in a man's body are you? She would have that kind of attitude. And a lot, I think, young men were just like almost laughing at her, like, okay, whatever. Come on in. That kind of. But yeah, we were talking about social Darwinism. This is a mindset that begins to develop that justifies immense amounts of poverty that it's becoming pervasive. Now, poverty obviously has always existed, but the type of poverty we're talking about that begins to develop in the Industrial Revolution is abject poverty, meaning it's just not a temporary condition. It's systematic. There's no way of getting out. The only jobs that are available are dangerous, and they don't pay enough. You got some big notes with? Yeah. You always want to. Yeah, that should be something automatic. Put something in front of you. Write things down so you're locked into what's going on. Too easy for minds to ruminate. The poverty is systematic. It's part of in other words, it's part of the system. It ain't going anywhere unless it's addressed. So what social Darwinism is a way of rationalizing it, justifying it. And this gentleman right here, his name is Herbert Spencer. He becomes this prominent thought leader, really for the business world, to justify this immense amount of wealth that is being developed in tandem with pervasive systematic poverty and connected to it. The reason why John D. Rockefeller is the wealthiest person in the world is because he's exploiting millions of workers. He's having them cultivate the wealth, and he's putting that wealth into his pocket. Therefore, they are poor. So now there are people who are speaking out against this, getting philosophical about it, but if you're a philosopher that is trying to justify this new corporate capitalist system that is emerging after the Civil War, that's entrenched to this day within our society, then yeah, you're going to get a lot of airplay. You're going to get published. And so it's the belief that those who adjust and adapt to their social environment are entitled to the benefits and wealth which society produces. So this is why it's referred to as Darwinism, because it's hijacking the theory of natural selection, which Charles Darwin was hypothesizing at this time, that has become theorized in scientific literature, that over the course of billions of years, right, the environment has changed. Again, for instance, this is a jigsaw puzzle. This was all one continent. It has spread over the course of years. That indicates there's been serious climate changes and species have had to adapt to it. Those species that can't adapt to geological climate change, they die out. Individuals die out within species. Those that adapt, and adapt means at one point, yeah, you might have a, what do you call it? Like a abnormality, might be deformed in some way as a species. You might have a larger beak as a finch. This is what Charles Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands. And if you have a large beak, maybe it's hard to get into plants that have small seed pods. But that larger beaked finch might be able to survive if there is a drought all of a sudden. No rains for a couple of years, and the plants begin to change. And finches with smaller beaks have a more difficult time surviving. And so what begins to happen is these large beaked finches. You're an individual within that species. You pass down that genetic information, and some of your offspring have it. And over the course, again, of a lot of time, then you begin to see something uniform happening within that species. So that's geological time. What Herbert Spencer is doing is, oh, we're seeing just change happen from one generation to another. It's a different environment. And some people are adapting to that. And those that are not should die out. The basic themes of this, it's not surprising that we have that. You've all heard of the Protestant work ethic before? Anyone have a sense of what that means?
Part of the universe.
Yeah, that's kind of a way of reducing it to its basic essence of what that means. Why do we refer to the Protestant work ethic? Why not the Catholic work ethic or the Hindu work ethic or the atheist work ethic?
Not the nature of it.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. America writ large, going back to the colonial era, absolutely has been a Protestant culture. Yes, we have Catholics, we have atheists, we have Buddhists, we have Muslims, but everybody's affected by the Protestant culture. Without going into too much detail about the Protestant Reformation and all of that, but there was a guy named John Calvin, very famous Protestant from England, who, reading his scripture, very great, very powerful, well-informed theologian, but he came up with a very interesting theological theory, biblically based. But the problem with isolating biblical passages and making some grand theory about it is be real careful with that. There's different ways of approaching the Bible, and sometimes when one grabs onto something from the Bible and then you prescribe it to yourself or especially others, you might be missing the point of what's in the Bible. Well, what he grabbed onto is I forget where it's at, but there's 144,000 elect. And what he meant by that is 144,000 people have already been selected by God. Of all of the human beings, we're going to heaven. So there's 100%, this was 100% grace versus work. You're either graced or you are not. And nobody knows who is and who is not. You could imagine, especially back in the day, we're talking 1600s, 1700s. This is not, atheism is not a thing. It's like, what I mean by that, it's not a choice to be religious. Everyday life is religious. And so if that becomes pervasive in your culture, well, that's very angst-ridden. One, I think people want to be good people, but what does it matter? If grace is 100% and works has nothing to do with your demise and going to heaven or hell. And so as you see this emerge, especially in New England and colonial New England, how do people have a sense of maybe they're the elect? Well, as Victor was pointing out, you work hard and the universe responds. And so, yeah, nobody knows for sure, but maybe if you're successful, you're making money, you're respected in your community, maybe that's an indication that you have God's grace and you are part of the elect. It's a Protestant work ethic is very, very American. Does anyone travel like to Europe or just anywhere abroad? Mexico? Anywhere. Americans, no matter what you look like, if you are really enculturated in America, you stand out in other countries. We carry ourselves differently. We're very angst-ridden people, right? In the Protestant work ethic creates a culture, whether you're Protestant or not, of we work to live rather than the other way around. I work, and so I get to live a life. Right? What am I getting that backwards? We live to work. I'm getting that backwards, right? The only way I live is if I work. That's not true in other societies. So like a lot of European nations, and this has a lot to do with how devastating World War II was in Europe. This is why it's different here than here. World War II was so devastating to Europe that it was almost a blank slate. And World War II was, prior to World War II was the Great Depression. Prior to the Great Depression was World War I. A lot of people in Europe are going, what is the use of capitalism, man? And that's terrifying to anyone in the business community in Europe, anyone in the business community and the political institutions in the United States. So because most of Europe is devastated, they developed very robust, since the late 1940s, and it's only progressed since, a very robust safety. They get paid leave off mandated by the government. 2 weeks up to 3 months, depending on which nation state in Europe you're talking about. Maternity leave, paternity leave, depending on what nation state you're talking about, a month, sometimes up to 2 years. Has anyone gone to a restaurant outside of the United States? How is it different? What did you notice that might have been a little bit different?
Can you guys hear me? Hello? Pick it up, pick it up.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Can y'all hear me? Hello?
It's just the attitude of the wait staff. Americans get really frustrated because we expect waiter, waitress right there. As soon as you walk in, here's your water. You walk into a restaurant in France or Spain, Italy, it's like, hey, how's it going? We'll be with you in a minute. Relax, enjoy yourself. This is an event. You're not just here to grab a quick meal, man. Stay for a couple of hours. Yeah. Right? Protestant work ethic, pervasive in American culture. Laissez-faire. What is laissez-faire referring to?
Loose government intervention
On what?
economic affairs.
Yeah, business. It literally means hands off. Hands off the economy. Now, that's never been necessarily true. The purpose of government is to provide a functional marketplace. That's always been the case throughout history. It's just to what degree. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, laissez-faire makes sense. This all goes back to Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market, right? You don't want government intervention to create necessarily a marketplace because people in a community will create that for themselves. And if government tries to impose too much, it corrupts that natural tendency. You're gonna have carpenters, you're gonna have blacksmiths, you're gonna have shipwrights, seamstresses, right? Whatever. And people buy and sell within their community. I know who the dairy farmer is. I know who the seamstress is. I know their reputation. If someone's produces bad product, you don't go to Yelp, you just hear about it in church. I'm not going to that person because they keep selling us sour milk, right? It's the invisible hand of the marketplace. Adam Smith, basically, posited back in kind of American Revolutionary times. Laissez-faire becomes problematic as we get into the Industrial Revolution. Because people are losing a great sense of autonomy and independence. We got a sense of this during the pandemic, right? Lockdown. Again, I think I asked this last week, but what did the grocery stores look like? During the lockdown. They were empty. That should have been a clue to us that we are economically interdependent on forces that we're not even aware of. And we have grown to think that there's grocery stores. If I got some money, the food is always going to be there. No, it's not. If there's any disruption to the supply chains, as we saw and experienced, there's no toilet paper, there's no meat, there's no milk, no cheese. How am I supposed to wipe myself? Think just how disempowered we are. That's an indication that over the course of time, going back to the Industrial Revolution, in every generation that's followed, we have become more economically and politically centralized. So we are dependent on forces that we're not aware of. In the last year, 6 months or so, gas prices have jumped $1 because of the conflict with Iran. That has real consequences for everyone in this room. Less money in your pocket because you got to put. So laissez-faire, people begin to question this. If people are becoming more and more dependent on market forces that they have no control over, we're becoming more urbanized. People are living more and more in cities. And by the time we get to the 1920s, more people are living in cities than they did in rural agricultural areas. That has a real effect on people's ability to survive in this world. No longer can you just have a little parcel of land and grow your own food and have livestock. City ordinances start putting conditions on that. You can't just go out and hunt in the middle of a city. You have no control about how much you get paid. You have no control about the safety of your food. So you guys are reading about the progressive era. Again, that begins in 1901, not because Theodore Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. The forces, the dynamics of the Industrial Revolution, of the progressive era, go back. Those conversations and movements began as early as the 1870s. But the reason why it starts in 1901 is for the first time we get a president who's willing to listen to communities outside the national business community. And one of the big things Theodore Roosevelt does is he commissions and creates the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. What piece of literature was that motivated from? Meaning having federal inspectors go into slaughterhouses and to make sure that they're safe. The Jungle, Upton Sinclair. That was a bestseller at the time. And so things are becoming more convenient with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, I kind of appreciate that I don't have to cut a chicken's head off every time I want to eat. Go fetch water. Slaughter a cow. It's kind of nice just to be able to stop at a McDonald's or go to the grocery store and have that stuff already processed. But how do you know the safety of that food? How do you know that when you buy hamburger, that comes from a cow? There's not rat meat in that or feces. Yeah, maybe that is happening, but there is some sort of sense that, well, there's inspectors out there, some police out there, policing the industry. So that begins in the progressive era. Yeah, there's a famous historical scene where Theodore Roosevelt invites these captains of industry that are involved or have some sort of stake in the food markets. And he has, they're all eating this like medium rare steak. And then at one point, he's talking about, I think there's a need to regulate your guys' industry. And of course, they're saying, no, we can control it ourselves. We're interested in making sure the quality's there because of capitalism. Because if I sell a product that is substandard, then they're going to go to my competitor, all that kind of stuff. And then he has one of them read a passage out of Upton Sinclair. They got mouthfuls of meat in their mouths. One of the passages in there. And it's brutal. It's in that book. Just workers who aren't getting paid enough, who don't really care, just shoveling in dead rats into the hopper, feces, cockroaches, diseased cows going into the slaughterhouse. They're like, Like they didn't want to eat after that. Yes, great point. So up in Sinclair, he's a socialist. He sneaks into a slaughterhouse, and his whole thesis of that book is look at what's happening to this immigrant labor force. Because they're not getting paid well, we get this poor quality of processed meat, hamburger. And so he was wanting people to look at that industry and to think of workers writ large across this country going, oh, they're not getting paid enough. They're being exploited. And so up in Sinclair has some quote, I tried to target the American readers' hearts, but instead I targeted their stomachs. So his whole point was to open up people's hearts and going, we can't exploit workers this way. One, it's just wrong. And two, yeah, if you want to be assured that the products you're getting are safe, then perhaps we treat our workers. Survival of the fittest, right? Again, just repeating what I talked about when I first introduced this. Those that adapt are worthy to survive. Those that do not are not worthy to survive. In other words, pathologizing poverty, making poverty a disease. And so this is a conversation we've been having since the Industrial Revolution, and there's two ways of approaching this conversation. Certainly, personal accountability is a thing, right? One can make stupid decisions, irresponsible decisions, and it's like, yeah, you're broke, dude, because you ran up the credit card, you can't hold the job, you have a drinking problem, you have a poor work ethic. But the conversation that begins in a society where people are becoming more and more economically interdependent, where they're losing their autonomy, there's also a more pervasive conversation on the streets, at least. Labor organizers, community activists, and organizers that are beginning to say that personal accountability doesn't explain the pervasiveness of abject poverty. This laissez-faire is getting called into question, and that's where we begin to see the progressive era from 1901 to 1917 begin to really address this. For the first time, the federal government is going to at least listen to labor. Again, Theodore Roosevelt, in this huge coal mining strike in 1902, the Anthracite strike, where across the country in various major coal mines, strikers or coal miners are going on strike, and now it's becoming winter's coming. And this is becoming a crisis. And so the industry is just basically, they're going after labor. Labor is striking because they want more pay, safer working conditions, all of that. And this is something Theodore Roosevelt, it's on his mind because, yeah, if this strike continues into the winter, people are going to die. People are going to freeze to death. Coal was the main source of heating people's homes. The degree of electricity is beginning to become more and more normal. There's huge pockets of the country that don't get electricity until we get to the 1930s. But coal is the source of all of that. And so someone in his cabinet said, because it's winter's coming. And he says, yeah, we've done this before. Why don't we use the U.S. Army to go after the strikers? And Theodore Roosevelt says, I like that idea. Let's use the U.S. Army. But not to go after the workers. If industry, because they were just being obstinate. These people are working for us. We don't have to listen to them. Their demands are absurd. Paid and not die or get maimed. Those were their demands. So Theodore Roosevelt basically threatens, yeah, we're going to use this U.S. Army to nationalize, make the coal mines part of the U.S. government. How do you like those apples? And then industry was like, okay, let's talk. They didn't want that to happen. So this is where we begin to see in the progressive era, this conversation about, yeah, laissez-faire probably isn't a way of creating a functional society where people can thrive and pursue happiness. Okay. We don't have to get into that. But basically, yeah, Herbert Spencer, the poor were viewed as weak, and like the rest of nature's processes had to be weeded out as they were considered a drag on society. Famous quote of his, fostering the good for nothing at the expense of the good is an extreme cruelty. And so he's trying to shoehorn, again, Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection into a changing society, an industrialized society. And so what's the implications of of this quote here? Fostering the good for nothing at the expense of the good. What does good mean? From Herbert Spencer's, think about that. This is an extreme cruelty. Who are the good for nothing? What people?
Like, ruling. Like
No. Good for nothing from Herbert Spencer's perspective is the ruling class.
Yeah.
Okay, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I thought
Like the good, like at the expense of good would be like the virtue.
wait. Fostering the good for nothing. No. These are the workers he's referring to. Yeah. The good is not the working class. At the expense of the good, this is the working class, or this is the ruling elite,
Oh,
the wealthy. Good for nothing are the workers who want more pay, safer working conditions.
oh,
You're having conversations. Europe was ahead of a minimum wage. That doesn't happen until we get to the 1930s in this country. Yeah, the good for nothing. Yeah, or people who are not independently wealthy, who are not industrialists, robber barons. Pretty much everybody. We're creating a new species, almost, he's arguing. Corporate capitalists. What happens if you foster, help, aid the good for nothing, the working class? Do you think from Herbert Spencer's perspective?
Which,
Yeah, you're taking away from them. But think about how he's sort of shoehorning Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection in here.
if you, it's like survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
Like, if you're rich, you're gonna survive, but if you're poor,
You shouldn't survive.
you shouldn't survive.
So if the government comes in and says, here's some food, here's some money,
It's like ruining that like natural selection.
yeah, you're only going to pass down those attributes, that culture that create poverty, of being lazy, of not being self-accountable. This is all from the perspective of social Darwinism. On to the next generation. And you're never going to, if you don't want to be poor, then get off your ass and work hard.
So it's like,
Save your money. Get your own business.
It's cyclical. He doesn't want the cycle to continue. He wants to stop it.
He wants to stop it. I mean, it's a way of addressing poverty, but it's not looking at it systematically.
Right.
It's pointing the finger at the individual and going, it's only your fault. Now, again, we can have individual examples of, yeah, I keep screwing up. Of course he's poor. But what people who are pushing back against Herbert Spencer, people like Mother Jones, are saying, so millions of people are good for nothing? What kind of society is that produces good for nothing people who are mired in tenement housing, rat infested, disease infested, working for very little pay and dangerous working conditions?
How is there a way for them to move up?
How can they possibly move up?
Right.
So you're going to work 16 hours at a steel mill, textile factory, and then in your waking hours create a business? Because that was the idea. This goes back even to the antebellum period, free soil ideology. Right? Work for somebody, learn the craft, whatever it is, blacksmith, carpenter, shipwright, and then start your own business. Well, for some people that worked, but once we get to the Industrial Revolution, that's becoming more and more difficult for people. This is the genesis of, again, we're using Darwinistic ideas here, of eugenics. What political ideology in the mid-20th century is going to borrow heavily from this American philosopher? What political philosophy is going to develop out of eugenics
Oh,
in the mid-20th century?
gosh.
Yeah, Nazis. That's what.
That's,
If you sat down with Hitler,
that was his whole idea.
had a cup of coffee with Hitler, and said, "Dude, why are you so bad, man? You're hurting people. Stop, you knucklehead." He would look at you and go, "I'm not trying to hurt people. I'm trying to help them. We're getting rid of the dregs of society that are just dragging civilization down. The Jews, the homosexuals, the mentally delayed. If those dredges pass down their genetic information, then we're just going to have all of these problems." It's pathological. But just like anybody, Hitler was probably a sociopath, so who knows how much self-reflection he did. But when you look at bad people, they could usually rationalize it. You talk to Herbert Spencer, he's going to say, "I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of poverty, man. I don't want government," because he's talking about this because you got people like Mother Jones, Eugene V. Debs, not Abigail Adams, is it Abigail Adams? That's the second president. Jane Addams. Right? These progressive socialists who are saying government needs to get involved. They need to develop infrastructure. I mean, first infrastructure, that was, let's have private industry do that. We saw, when we were talking about Mother Jones, what big event shifts urban areas of saying the fire departments probably shouldn't be in the private sector, meaning fire departments were privately owned. Yeah, the Chicago fire, right? Those conversations are beginning to have. So he's responding against that, going, no, the market, the private market should always be the answer. Laissez-faire. Don't foster the good for nothing, because they're only you only just perpetuate it. All right. So as far as numbers are concerned, like people following him, not so much, but John D. Rockefeller likes this jam. Andrew Carnegie likes this jam. So he's on the lecture circuit. He's being published. He's influencing how professors get hired in universities and economic departments. So this becomes entrenched, and it becomes very difficult for people on the ground, community organizers, labor organizers, to fight against this. And we're still dealing with this, right? One solution you hear out there of addressing our current wealth disparity is to have a wealth tax. Wealth tax, not income tax, wealth tax. Because a lot of, like if you ask Elon Musk, "Hey man, can I borrow $100? He probably doesn't have $100 on him. His wealth derives from stocks and land and capital from his, SpaceX. So he could literally buy a Lear jet without any cash at all and just leverage his pre-existing wealth. So you hear people out there in political, on the political spectrum saying, we need to start taxing the wealthy, whatever, 10% of their wealth in order to help infrastructure in this country, schools, hospitals, education, medical care, that kind of a thing, right? Well, the pushback against that is, and this is very social Darwinistic, is the wealthy are the job producers. Without the wealthy, we don't have jobs, right? It's very social Darwinistic. The people that make this society functional, the degree it is, are the wealthy. And the degree that you interfere with that is only going to hurt people on the ground. Sometimes that's referred to as trickle-down economics. Give the wealthy industry tax breaks, and theoretically what they'll do is reinvest that tax windfall into their industries. They'll open up storefronts, factories, warehouses. That'll create more jobs. People have more money in their pockets, and you'll have this upward spiral going up, and everyone will benefit from it. Trickle-down economics, as far as history is concerned, and this goes, we'll study this when we look at the 1920s. It works if it's targeted. Like, we want this industry to thrive. So let's say we want solar panels to thrive. Maybe it makes sense to give that industry a tax break so they can compete internationally. But once anything becomes an ideology, whether you're talking about socialism, laissez-faire, trickle-down economics, and it's just, I only have a hammer and I'm going to the construction site with just a hammer. Well, you're not really good for anything, right? You need a saw, you need a jigsaw, you need a ruler, you need tools. So this is sort of anytime you hear anyone say, this is the answer, only this is the answer, at least being curious about, well, what's really being said here? All right, let's skip through this. Let's just get to a prime example of social Darwinism, John D. Rockefeller, who definitely buys into this. And John D. Rockefeller, amazing individual. I mean, talk about the American dream and entrepreneurship. He didn't grow up poor, but came from kind of, humble middle-class origins. And during the Civil War, he, prior to 1863, him and another guy, they invested, they basically were, they were suppliers to the Union Army. So they supplied the Union Army with clothes and just whatever, just things that the Army needed. And he's young, he's in his early 20s, and he amasses $50,000, which would be almost $1 million today. And what does he invest that money into, which was wild? People thought he was out of his mind. But he understood. He was a great entrepreneur. He invested in petroleum, rock oil. Now, today, to us, that sounds like, well, of course he did. We were relying on steam and coal back then. Oil, and this is what his company started out with, was to supply oil lanterns for the second industrial revolution, which more becomes petroleum-based as we get into the 20th century. But yeah, oil used to destroy people's land in Texas all the time. So you had some land in the 1840s, and then oil starts bubbling up, and you were a cattle farmer. Your land is ruined. So this is kind of wild that he did this. He must have had some information, or just saw. I mean, it was understood that it was just beginning to be understood the potential energy in oil, and there's a tremendous amount of latent energy in oil if you know how to refine it. He's able to organize Standard Oil by 1870. And his entrepreneurial spirit made him realize this concept that he referred to as money power. This process became the key drive for the rise of Standard Oil. Money power. What does that mean? Essentially, it means pay nobody a profit. What does that mean? Well, one, he's gonna, as Standard Oil is becoming bigger and bigger, he's got leverage now with the railroad. So oil is shipped by railroads back then primarily across the country. So he could go to a railroad company and say, I'm gonna give you guys huge amounts of oil to transport. You guys are gonna make money. My competitor over there, you're going to start charging him more money. He's using his money power to leverage the market. One way. demanded higher freight rates for competitors to suppress his market rival. And then their chart, this is how he's able to expand Standard Oil, and eventually it becomes a monopoly. Because now that their freight costs are going up, some of these companies are going bankrupt, and he's privy to this, and he's right there at their door, sends his lawyers going, well, how about we buy your company? Standard Oil is becoming bigger and bigger. So pay no one a profit is the established and operating doctrine to completely eliminate intermediate merchant fees and produce. And what he does, what is being said here is, so he not just has a monopoly on his industry. With that money power, he's able to buy up steel refineries and pipeline companies and railroads. And this is what he means by pay no one a profit. So he has all these subsidiary companies that are producing the things that his company needs, barrels, pipelines. And so the money's always coming back to him. And so by the time we get to the early 20th century, yeah, he's standing as the most wealthiest individual who's ever walked the planet throughout all of history. And that was true up until quite recently. Elon Musk has pushed him off that man. So there's lots of talk, and this is again why the progressive era begins this year. Again, Theodore Roosevelt is the first president that is going to leverage pre-existing legislation to go after unions, or not unions, to go after monopolies. At first, the legislation that was intended to go after monopolies passed in the 1890s was going after unions. So there's talk about, yeah, we need to get rid of these monopolies. They're driving up the prices, wages are going down, the quality of product is becoming less. And so he's constantly giving talks about basically social Darwinism and how monopolies are actually good for society. So this is a famous passage of the talk he gave, the rose analogy. The growth of a large business is merely survival of the fittest, John D. Rockefeller said. The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which bring cheer to its beholder, only by sacrificing the early bud. So anyone who knows about plants, you want a beautiful rose, yeah, anytime you see a bud below it, you want to cut those so you can have a cluster of beautiful flowers, right? You don't let the thing grow wild and crazy. This is not an evil tendency of business. It is merely the working out of law of nature and the law of God. Big claim he's making right there to justify monopolies, which is again and again coming under attack during these days. And we begin to see some traction in between this time period, 1901 and 1917, during the progressive era. But it's something we're still dealing with, right? Today, media outlets becoming monopolized, right? There's like a handful of people who own most of the media. Right here in Texas, HEB, Walmart, right? Well, that's not good for wages. That's not good for prices. And outside of the valley, you're going to see stores like Safeway, Lucky's, Albertsons. Right? Yeah.
Food chain preferences.
Yeah.
More mom and pop restaurants, shops.
That's a good point, man. And we're really lucky because there's some good locally owned eateries here. Taquerias, man. Yeah, I get it, man. You just want a quick burger, go get some McDonald's. Man, if you got some time, well, go to a place that's owned by a family that lives here in McAllen or Weslaco or Bar. Because that money stays in the community. You go to McDonald's, manager gets a little, maybe $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. And the rest of the profit goes to the McDonald's headquarters, wherever that's based. Yeah. And all the money that we spend at McDonald's, sucked out of here. It's a form of colonialism within the United States. That's what corporate capitalism, one of the issues of corporate capitalism. So let's talk about something real controversial here, Karl Marx. I bring up Karl Marx because people like Mother Jones are reading their Karl Marx and is creating more and more workers to entertain the possibility of socialism and communism. And understand that that is something that is becoming pervasive, whether one agrees with it or not. In fact, when we get to the 1930s, 1932, basically 1940, the New Deal. Under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We're going to see a huge, I mean, there's some big reforms that happen in the progressive era, but we see revolutionary reforms under the New Deal. And FDR's approach is, we're us, because he comes from people who disagree with him, from the right, capitalist, conservatives, accuse him of being a class traitor. And what he's trying to convince these people is, you guys love capitalism, I love capitalism, right? Giving us a very comfortable life. But if we want to maintain it, we've got to create a balance between the virtues of socialism and the virtues of capitalism. And that conversation is going back to the 1870s. The 1930s, what people like to commend FDR is that balance he struck, because during the Great Depression, we were very, very close to either having a socialist revolution, communist revolution perhaps, or a fascist revolution, which is always a possibility. Having and either of those options, they're different, but they're all predicated on authoritarianism. This is what happened in Russia. It's on paper, communism sounds great, but how do you implement it? And it wasn't that socialism, communism destroyed Russia. It was done from an authoritarian perspective. What destroyed the Nazis? Authoritarian. It's sort of like you can get some results with authoritarianism, but it's sort of like eating a bunch of candy bars before you go to the gym. Yeah, you'll get some results. You put people to work. You might have some stability. But the thing about authoritarian, and it's almost universal, I can't think of any in history where an authoritarian had a healthy ego. Typically, an authoritarian is someone who has a very unhealthy ego, and they only surround themselves with people who agree with them. Right? And so, if a good leader is somebody who says, I want people who disagree with me always talking to me, so I can know for myself when I am wrong and when I am right. Just have people saying, yes, sir, that's a great idea. We should exterminate 6 million Jews. That's a brilliant idea. Let's make it happen. Okay. Not such a good idea. We should attack Russia in the middle of the winter. That's what the Nazis did. Not Adolf Hitler might have won World War II if he didn't do that. But he did like what Napoleon did 100 years prior. Sent his army into Russia in the middle of the winter. And that was the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime. Why did that happen? His generals were terrified of him. They were like, yes, sir, stupid, but you're the boss. Okay, so I bring this up because, yeah, people are beginning to read their Karl Marx. He's a European philosopher, German, very, very popular in Europe, and he's making his way, his literature is making his way into the labor movement. So what Karl Marx one-on-one, and it's not, he doesn't, a lot of these ideas are just kind of flipping previous philosophical observations of political economy in favor of the working class as an identity. But means of production. Class relations are fundamentally defined by who owns and controls the means of production. What is a means of production? A factory, right? A store, an internet site, right? PayPal, Amazon. Those are means of product. They produce things. A farm, right? Anything that produces capital, right? And so the question when it comes to the means of production is who benefits from that means of production? Is it just a handful of people who manage it and own it? Or maybe there should be room for the people who actually produce the wealth within that means of production, the workers. This is what Karl Marx is going to bring. History, he's sometimes referred to Karl Marx as an historian. He's somewhat of an historian, as a reductionist, because he reduces the dynamic of history to point two, historical dualism. Society is split dualistically, slave versus slave owner. Serf versus feudal lord. Worker versus capitalist. And he argued that whether you're talking about ancient Rome, Egypt, modern day, European society, America, history is moved by that tension between these dualistic forces. Slave owners exploit slaves, put money in their pocket. Sometimes slaves organize. They have huge rebellions. Maybe they overthrow the entire industry of slavery, like Civil War. That's how history moves. It's a building up tension between this exploitive relationship. And then you have these explosions and sometimes revolutions or reforms to government. Number three, driven by a process of wealth accumulation, capitalism remains unstable, facing periodic. This is interesting. And this is unique to capitalism. Epidemics of overproduction. Epidemics of overproduction. That's a very nuanced Marxist term there. That's interesting. Because overproduction prior to corporate capitalism would have been a windfall. The serfs working the land for the feudal lords, they overproduced wheat. Nobody's going to starve this winter. Why in a capitalist system is this a crisis, an epidemic? So again, prior to corporate capitalism, prior to the Industrial Revolution, overproduction would have been a windfall. If the serfs produced more wheat, nobody's starving this winter. They overproduced wheat. They produced more wheat than we thought they would.
A lack of dependence on the people, like on the higher ups, right?
No. Think about this. Yes. Prices go up. Capitalists don't.
They'd rather have an underproduction.
Yeah. So you're I don't know, creating automobiles. And last year you sold a couple million F-250s. You're thinking, dude, I just made a ton of money selling 2 million F-250s. This year at the board meeting, we're going to double the amount of F-250s that are going to be produced at our factories. Put them on the market. You know, a bunch of people already have F-250s, and perhaps maybe the economy takes a downturn. Somewhat, yeah, this is what he's talking about. Absolutely. Yeah, so what if you're the CEO of Ford and you created 50% more F-250s and nobody's buying them? How do you're still interested in making a profit? You could probably leverage a profit out of this, but what's the first thing you're going to do? You can lower the price, which is going to be less profit. Yeah, lower the price, put it on sale.
Say that it's like
You can manipulate, you can lie a little bit, but there needs to be some truth and transparency because corporations have shareholders. And if you have enough share of stocks in a corporation, you get a seat at the table. You get to vote. And yeah, if you're a CEO and you lie to your shareholders, you could be criminally liable for lying. So lying happens, but you want to be really, really smart about how you lie. So you could lower prices. You're still you're still having to produce, you still have, okay, that's not going to help you with the maintenance of your factories. You still are going to be producing trucks. You do, yeah, you can make a special. You can say, hey, we're going to throw in, I don't know, satellite radio in here, whatever. I don't know. I haven't bought a car in a long time. I don't know what. So, yes, layoffs. Layoffs. Later workers off. That's what led to the Great Depression. It was an epidemic of overproduction. We'll look at this closely when we get to the 1920s. We're seeing this whole social Darwinism, laissez-faire. Let's not regulate industry. Well, that changes in the progressive era to some degree, somewhat to a large degree, but not systematically. Kind of tweaks around the edges. Well, there's a backlash against this because obviously the business community isn't going to want to be regulated. In the 1920s, you've heard of the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. The government, the federal government, is going to give tax breaks to the business community. Tariffs are going to rise quite a bit during the 1920s. And that's going to give the business community a sense of overconfidence, and that's what they do. They overproduce. And that bill comes due in 1929 when the stock market crashes, and it leads to not just a downturn in the economy, but a collapse. Epidemic of overproduction. It's one of the weird things about capital. It creates scarcity, where scarcity was non-existent before. And then, yeah, so this is kind of a contradiction. These are both big contradictions in capitalism that Karl Marx argued. Those contradictions will almost naturally topple capitalism down. Profit versus pay. A core contradiction exists between maximizing capitalist profit and providing worker pay. Pay your workers as little as possible. And if every industry is doing that, to every worker, or pretty much every worker, well, people don't have money in their pocket to purchase the things that capitalists are producing. It destroys the economy. And since they have all of the money, the capitalists, this is why he was saying that there needs to be, Karl Marx was arguing that perhaps a violent revolution is necessary. Workers unite, go after the capitalists. Why? Well, what's the function of the state? Quote Karl Marx, the executive of the modern state, the government, is but a committee for the managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is a French word that just basically means the business community. So wealthy people in big industries basically put people in office that only focus on the business community. So he said, when he's looking at the United States, he says, yeah, they got checks and balances to undermine the possibility of tyranny, but there's only one conversation happening in the US government. The business community. Which is important. You need to have voices that say, you need to have a thriving business community. But if you don't have also at the table people who come from the working class who've experienced this. Opening up the fridge. Okay, driving down the road, looking at your gas tank and you're empty. I don't get paid for a few days. What am I going to do? There's wealthy classes. I mean, imagine that. 60% of people who are independently wealthy were born into that wealth. Yes, the American dream does exist. There are people who come from poverty or lower middle class and are able to amass wealth, that's awesome. But so it's not to say that wealthy people are bad, but that's to humanize them. If you've never experienced opening up the fridge or your cupboard or driving down the road and seeing your tank on E, you've never experienced that. And now you are running for Senate or governor of a state. You don't have that lived experience. So you could be well-intended, but you don't know what it's like. And so, and if you come from a sense of superiority, like I know what to do for the poor people of this country, I'm just going to create this policy and this will fix everything. Or any that can lead to that, because it probably does feel pretty good to be infinitely wealthy. And if you're not careful about your own ego, you can develop a sense of superiority. I earned all of this, and these people who are poor, they didn't. Yeah.
Do you feel like that's like similar to like the NYC like mayor election? Do you think like that's like a similar?
Yeah, it's not just Zoran Mandami, he's the face of that, but without his supporters and volunteers, I imagine, and I know some of those people, they come from the working class. And so when they heard on the media that he's going to create city-run grocery stores, and it was kind of a big boogeyman, like this is socialism, this is communism, they said, no, this is an avenue to get cheaper groceries. It's an interesting policy. It's not unique to New York City. It's actually kind of common in the Midwest. You have a city-run grocery store, and what does that do to privately owned grocery stores? It creates competition. Prices come down for everybody. It's not free groceries. There's nowhere in New York City where you can get free groceries, but it's a co-op run by the government. I have a spot. So yeah, anytime you see someone like Mandami who's arguing for free, cheaper grocery stores, rent freezes, that's deriving usually from people who have an experience of, I know what it's like to do without, right? So like, for instance, Ocasio-Cortez, what did she do before she became a Congress member?
Bartender.
Yeah. So she's had that experience of, does anyone work in the food industry? Wait staff, bartender?
I used to.
You know what this is like? Like, okay. You put your chips down. You're like, yes, I'll be able to buy groceries this week. Or, yeah. So she's had that experience. So whether you agree with her policy or not, her ideology, understand that's what he's talking about. Are you going to have a functional government if the only conversation in government is from the business community? And it's so entrenched, what Karl Marx argued is, we need to have no violent revolution. What he didn't foresee is the communist revolution happening in Russia. Because he argued that he wasn't he was a critic of capitalism, but he admired capitalism for the amount of energy it produced. And it is. If you think, we have skyscrapers and airplanes and cars and rockets, computers, iPhones. That's all due to the virtue of capitalism. That's somebody who took a chance, created entire industries. So it unleashes amazing amounts of human energy that benefit the consumer. Now we've got all of these tools to help our lives be easier. But because it has all these contradictions in it, paying your workers as little as possible, epidemic of overproduction, a pervasive culture that tries to maintain a government that only hears the voices of the business community, laissez-faire, it's not sustainable. It's going to collapse under its own weight. And so what Karl Marx predicted is communism was going to happen in Germany or England or the United States, because in order to have viable communism, according to Karl Marx, he could be completely wrong on this, but this is what he argued. Capitalism needs to produce the infrastructure. Roads, highways, cars, transportation, communication, make our lives easier. And when the exploitation becomes intolerable, then people rise up and they share They don't take it over, but they share the wealth that is derived from the means of production. So yeah, they're reading that kind of stuff. So what we see happening, and just we're getting to the end of this, is the labor movement is coming out of this milieu of corporate capitalism. You've got a radical movement of the labor movement, which is get rid of capitalism. What's the problem? Corporate capitalism. What's the proper objective? Reject corporate capitalism. And they were incredibly successful early on. And one of they're not going to be this movement of the labor movement is not going to be sustaining though. It's going to give rise to this trade perspective or business unionism. Because one thing the radicals began to learn is if you go to the strikes, you hear about strikes today, and there's a tremendous amount of personal sacrifice to anybody who's involved in a strike. But since the 1930s, they're protected by the government. You have a right to strike if you belong to a recognized union and you've gone through the steps. It's not a wildcat strike. You're not just walking off the job. There's been negotiations. You have a right to strike. Back then, no, you don't have a right to strike. Very dangerous back then. All it would take is a factory manager or someone like Rockefeller to pay young men $20, $30, $50 a day, give them a club and a shotgun, strike over, or bring in immigrant labor, or bring in black labor. You got Irish immigrants coming in, they're on strike. Okay, let's bring in some black labor from the South. You had Irish immigrants starting the railroads. They went on strike. Who did the most of the building of the railroad, the Intercontinental Railroad? The Chinese. That wasn't
They brought in the Chinese.
they brought in the Chinese to undermine workers. Very much so.
Yeah.
So the radical unionists are saying, are passive reasoning. What that means is we need to educate the workers. They need to read their Karl Marx and understand and open up unions and to get rid of class distinction or group distinctions. So the radical unions like Knights of Labor, open to women, open to minorities, open to skilled and unskilled labor. So it did a great thing in getting the word out about unions and built up huge numbers. The problem though, because they were a little bit timid, not always. Some of these people were very aggressive and striking, but just talking generally. There's a scene in a movie that I always remember. It was a biop on Woody Guthrie. It was, if you know anything about Bob Dylan, it was the inspiration of Bob Dylan. He was a folk singer in the 1930s, 1940s, sang about a lot of what people were going through in the Great Depression. This land is your land, right? That's Woody Guthrie. And there's this great scene in that movie where I think it's a coal mining strike, or they're organizing coal miners, and there's some kind of nerdy guy that probably looks like me, in his little tweed jacket, and he's talking about the means of production, the epidemic of overproduction. He's talking to coal miners who are hungry, and he's trying to educate them on these structural dynamics. That you need to learn this so we know what we're up against, and so we can organize, and the workers could rise up, and we could take over the means of production. Dude, these people need to eat now. And this great scene of what Woody Guthrie's in the back with his guitar, and he's reading the room, and the workers are just probably what some of you guys are doing right now, going, "What? Means of production?" So Karl Marx just goes up, or not Karl Marx, Woody Guthrie goes up there with his guitar, and he just starts playing some union songs. And now everybody's dancing and like, yeah, organize, sign right here, you know. So it's ineffective in the long run. It basically created a movement, but what takes the movement are the trade unions business unions. Now, the nature of the problem for trade unions is management, not capitalism. Capitalism's here to stay, baby. It's like rock and roll. It ain't going anywhere. So let's work with management. What do we need for management? Higher pay, safer work conditions. Not get rid of capitalism. That's that destroys the conversation. No capitalist is going to sit down going, okay, you guys want to negotiate and getting rid of capitalism? Okay, there's no conversation to be had there. So the trade unions, and this is like the AFL under Samuel Gompers is going to lead this. You guys will read that in the textbook. Proper objective is not to, again, to reject corporate capitalism, but to adjust. What do we want? Higher pay. That's an adjustment. Safer working conditions, less hours, 8-hour workday. And yeah, if we organize workers, and organizing workers isn't just signing papers, it's every time there's a paycheck, you got to pay the union a couple of dollars. Has anyone ever been in a union? Yeah, they're pretty rare these days. Yeah, they're kind of rare in Texas. I worked for UPS, Teamsters Union, and yeah, I did this in my early 20s, but yeah, I would have to pay like $60, $80 per paycheck. Why do you have to do that? Well, if you go on strike, you're not going to get your wages, but the union will be able to subsidize your wages, get you food, housing, right? So create the leverage so you can talk to management. Because what is management interested in? Profit. If workers go on strike, no profit. So if all the workers are on strike, then we can have a conversation. Yeah.
I worked for a factory,
Uh-huh.
and there were two sets of workers. There were union and non-union,
Mm-hmm. Oh, weird.
and
Oh,
I was
it's
part of non-union,
Mhm.
so I got paid $22 an hour, and the union workers got paid 14 because they pay like a section
Oh,
of it
I gotcha. Yeah.
to the actual union.
Yeah, that's what was I here in Texas? Indiana. Yeah, there's Texas, Indiana is one of these states, it's the right to work state, which means if they, like in California, if you belong to a union, you like UPS, you don't get to opt out. You pay your union dues. So that's interesting. You would have those tiers of pay because people are paying into their union dues.
They eventually got rid of the union.
Yeah, that's kind of the point. Because it's either got to be all or nothing if it's going to be effective. And what are unions, besides getting you better pay and working conditions, it gives you a voice too. This is how it benefits workers. So for instance, and this is where sometimes people get frustrated with unions, because especially if you're in an industry where there's a lot of power of that union. I was 19 when I worked for UPS. Dude, I had to be at work at 5 in the morning as a loader and unloader. At 19, so I had a few occasions where it would be 6:30 in the morning, and I would hear this. That would be going off for a while. My alarm. I was not mature enough to have, it was a good paying job with benefits. I worked part-time, living by myself. And, this happened 3 times. So 3 times and you're fired. And so I just quit going. Quit going to work. Oh, the 3rd time I'm fired. And then my shop steward, the union rep at the place, called me up and said, hey, where you been? We miss you. So, well, I was late 3 times. I got fired. It's like, nobody officially fired you. And if you want your job back, we could negotiate you coming back. Then I just made a cost benefit. Like, that's too early in the morning, man. I'm 19, 20 years old. So I said, thanks, but no thanks. But yeah, it gives you a voice, right? And that's where we're going to see unions develop slowly some success. But again, that success isn't going to come, meaning that unions are going to really have some power until the federal government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the Wagner Act finally recognized that unions can exist and created a system that if you have grievances with your employer, you could file it with the labor department. Corporations cannot, they cannot willingly try to destroy union organization. And it always just depends on who's in office if those things are going to be supported or not. But striking is going to be the main component of the labor movement. And that's where we're going to see radical unions begin to dissipate. One historical reason why we see radical unions dissipate, and we talked about this when we were talking about Mother Jones' autobiography, is the Haymarket Affair. That was blamed on radical unions, anarchy. So people started shifting towards the propensity of trade unions. The problem with trade unions, though, is they're strategically discriminatory. We're not going to organize non-skilled workers. If you pull a lever all day at a factory, we don't want you in the union. They're not going to be as they're going to be a little bit more. There will be some women, but mainly it's going to be men. There are definitely some racism involved, and it's all strategic though, and it's sort of reflective of white supremacy in this country. But so white men, a lot of them are organized that. Why would they do that? Because white men are competing with Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, right? And so they're trying to concentrate their working pool in order to give them more leverage. Also, just the culture. Now they can go to the press going, look at what this industry is doing to white men. They are exploiting them. And so they get a little bit of benefit because the society writ large favors white people over Irish immigrants. Irish people were not considered white back in the day. Those kinds of things. So examples of radical unions, Knights of Labor. Again, just to repeat, Haymarket Affair is going to begin to lessen the appeal of radical unions like the Knights of Labor. Plus, radical unions are very inclusive. But if you're organizing non-skilled workers, you don't have much leverage because you can teach anybody to pull a lever all day. You want to organize engineers and construction workers and coal miners, which is a skilled labor, right? That kind of a thing. Where we're going to see successes in unions is organizations like the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and we begin to see a shift in trade unions or business unions working with business beginning in the late 1880s. So yeah, don't have to focus too much on this slide, but Samuel Gompers championed business unionism, focusing on practical economic goals like wages and working conditions rather than broad political upheavals. We'll come back to this. We've got a couple more things to talk about. Tomorrow, we'll finish up this. Tuesday, yeah, this will work. And then I want to touch on, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the progressive era. You guys will get that from the chapter, but I do want to touch on one of the big flashpoints in the progressive era, the women's suffrage movement. So we'll finish up this lecture tomorrow, and then we'll go through the history of the women's suffrage movement from 1848 to 1920. And so from 1848 to 1912, we'll cover that in discussion and lecture. The last 8 years of the women's suffrage movement, 1912 to 1920, where the women's suffrage achieved its victory with the 19th Amendment. We'll learn that from, has anyone seen the film Iron Jawed Angels? Pretty cool film, which covers the last 8 years of the women's suffrage movement. It stars Hilary Swank. Not the movies too much these days, but she's
Or she works herself and she's faced with like discrimination, or no?
No, she actually she plays a real person named Alice Paul. Alice Paul comes from a very Quaker family, very educated, privileged. But there are working class women in that film. But anyway, Iron Jawed Angels is about the last 8 years of the women's suffrage movement. and how they had to strategize to finally earn, not be given, earn the right to vote in this country in 1920. So continue on with your bundles. If you earn a C or a B or an A for bundle 2 by tomorrow before class, come talk to me. Don't have a C for bundle 2 by Wednesday, that pay me 200. So don't let that happen yet. Anyway, I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you just go talk to us about it.
Yeah,
But
it's
probably
because
that
you
you
had to amend it.
But you weren't here.
Yeah, I was just reading,